order is filled with a lot of hot takes, to put it lightly, and it's pretty much the same when it comes to film. So today I decided to react to some of the steamiest of film hot takes I could find online to see if they are onto something, or maybe if I should delete this app for my own mental health. But before we get into that, make sure you hit the subscribe button on the road to 1K subs, and so that amazing film content is readily available for you, and also make sure you drop your own hot takes in the comments below. Probably a hot take, but I prefer Raimi's implied body horror take on Spider-Man, organic webbing, and whatever the F was with Peter's fingers. And yes, 1000%. I've always liked the idea of Spider-Man actually being a Spider-Man, because in many interpretations before and after the Raimi trilogy, without his tech, he is just an athletic dude with good reflexes that can stick to walls, which could literally make him based on any of the hundreds of other insects or animals that fit into that category. Showing these features such as organic webbing and microscopic barbed hairs not only gives cool in-universe explanations for how Peter's abilities operate, but it embraces that more mutate side of Peter being a Spider-Man. Plus, I don't know, I think it just looks really cool. I don't know if this is a hot take, but this movie, Black Panther Wakanda Forever, has not been holding up for me. I think Shuri was phenomenal, and I still think the movie was great, it just ain't sticking up there at the top for me. When it comes to Wakanda Forever, it's always been a movie that was dealt an unfair hand. From coming off the generational hype of the original movie, to dealing with the tragic loss of such an amazing actor in person, R.I.P. Chadwick Boseman. But Ryan Coogler and his team did do the impossible with this movie, definitely making something out of nothing, because they were able to expertly look at their shortcomings and turn it into some of the movie's biggest strengths, developing this tragic passing into a well-executed internal conflict within Shuri over whether to follow her more freeing spirituality or her more grounded and controlled technology. This ultimately culminating into a very well done cameo from the character of Killmonger, someone who also faces that mass internal conflict, which leads to this aggression against the world. Let's not even talking about the incredible world building and that fleshing out of the people of Talokan, and topping that off with the Oscar style performance from Angela Bassett. From a pure quality standpoint, I truly think this movie can compete with some of the best, with really only 6 to 7 movies in my opinion being outright better, and they are pretty much all team-up movies to some degree. The rest in my eyes are either comparable or outright worse. The thing is, it's not the actual quality that hurts this movie's reputation, but again, those pesky outside narratives that are ruining it. You have that crowd that is upset because they killed off T'Challa instead of recasting him. You have the crowd that can't put this over the original, even though this is the objectively better film. And it came out in 2022, which was definitely the year of peak MCU hate so far, coming off the backs of 2 hyped up yet pretty disappointing movies with Multiverse of Madness and Love and Thunder, as well as increased irritation with the required reading with the Disney Plus shows. I do think that Wakanda Forever can be compared with the best, but it does have a lot of other external battles to deal with first. Real firearms should be used in science fiction films more often, not laser blasters, but like the stuff they use in regular action movies. You see, we as moviegoers are just pretty conditioned to associate in the world of high-tech, regular firearms are just relatively primitive. It also unnecessarily grounds a project that by nature is supposed to be the furthest thing from it. It really depends on the project itself, but it's also generally just easier to see laser blasters than bullets, which makes it a bit easier to visually show the gravity of certain high-packed action scenes. So I personally would disagree with this take, but it ultimately depends on the project. Outer Banks and On My Block Season 1 over anything else on Netflix. I'm just gonna give you the benefit of the doubt and say you're like 13 years old. I mean, 50% of my jokes are on how bad Netflix projects are, but even this is a little too crazy for me. I'll say an unpopular opinion. I want to see another Lightyear movie. Lightyear is a project that stumbles over itself constantly and whose writing is so trivialized that it insults the intelligence of their target demographic, who of which are literal children. But yes, even I would take another Lightyear movie or a spin-off project than another Toy Story movies. That specific part of the franchise just needs to call it quits. But heavy criticism aside, I am actually not opposed to the fundamental idea of Lightyear. With taking this beloved film figure and framing his character in the context of another story, it's why I'm pretty chill with characters such as Batman or Spider-Man being rebooted in film, so long as it's a new and interesting take of said character. Like the 2017/2019 version of it gave a more character-carrying version of the Stephen King tale, which combined with modern visual effects gave a pretty good movie. The Batman seemed to be a return of that more brooding detective side of Bruce, which again led to a pretty great movie. Making sequel after sequel, you can only do so much with a specific interpretation, so I wouldn't mind at all seeing something like a spin-off Woody and Jesse movie, or hey, Andy's Life After the Toys. Speaking of remakes though, unpopular opinion, but I'm excited for the Harry Potter remake. The original movies barely scratched the surface of the source material. Personally, I think the spin-off route is the better choice here. I'm sure the depth they will go into as a long-form television will surely surpass that of the original films and make book readers faint over the more faithful live-action series, but putting that effort into making this adaptation just runs the risk of making the Wizarding World feel small, because we were already given the story in live action, and whether if you liked it or not, it was a smash hit. You can't keep running back to good old Harry and friends whenever things get tough, especially when you have so much more to explore in the Wizarding World. These resources could easily be put into making certain one-shots that exclusively focus on the scenes that were missing from the original film, an adaptation of the sequel book, or maybe a better sequel series entirely. I'll look at other Wizarding schools, or hey, if you do follow the same story as before, maybe change it up drastically as you can and give us another perspective. At its heart, it kind of seems like they're obsessively sticking to what they know will work in the storm of fear sparked by the issues surrounding the other Wizarding World projects, like the prequel film series that is the furthest thing from well received, and a video game franchise that was basically written off by half the potential player base before the game even released. So it just leaves this rebooted project that kind of reeks of nostalgia bait in order to gain any type of solid footing during these pretty uncertain times. Hot take, there is not a single bad Rocky/Creed film. I think you're giving Rocky 5 a bit too much credit there, and if we're being honest, a little hot take myself, but as iconic as Rocky 4 is, you can't tell me that isn't 50% music video. Unpopular opinion, but we do not need to know about movies 3 and 4 years before they're set to release. Yeah, this can be annoying if a franchise doesn't have concurrent projects out that can hold you over until those announced movies are more formally shown, because then it's like a little tease that you're just stuck with to deal with yourself that's eventually going to be forgotten about by most in like a month's time. But if it's a franchise with a project concurrently coming out, then I can see its appeal. Like Comic-Con 2014, when Marvel announced the whole slate of films that lead into late 2018, it was hype because we could see the development into those projects starting that same year with The Winter Soldier and Guardians of the Galaxy. But I couldn't imagine them announcing Infinity War back in like 2014, and we just had to sit there and wait on that news alone for like 3 years until the trailer dropped. Miguel was right, it's just the 2023 version of Thanos was right. A hot take centered around contrarianism and misinterpreting the central themes of the film these characters are featured in, which very obviously show their perspectives are not to be agreed with. I think a pretty important distinction this commentator may have accidentally overlooked in their analysis is that the people who may say things such as Miguel was right typically are looking at things from a more literal perspective, while this commentator's analysis is more focused around that narrative perspective. Obviously, as the antagonist of a story, the narrative will almost always be framed around you being in the wrong, the protagonist having the moral high ground over you. However, you still have those gray area moments when the motivation behind the antagonist's actions are so solid that they would be more convincing than the protagonist if they executed their plan in a more practical sense. As in, if the story wasn't specifically geared around the protagonist being the one in the right. Based purely on intentions, Thanos wasn't necessarily evil to pursue action to combat the increasingly quick depletion of resources amongst the universe. It's just the fact that he was also the antagonist in the story, so they wrote him to slaughter multiple people, they wrote him to cause huge suffering, and they wrote him to be incompetent with his use of the Infinity Stones. The writers recognize that his intentions are in good faith, so they have to frame him and his journey in a negative light, so it can hopefully overshadow the validity of his original ideals. They couldn't have just made him peacefully talk to the Avengers to get the Infinity Stones and snap the universe into having double the resources, because there would be no conflict there. So they make him snap half the universe away, on top of being this brutal warrior, and now he can properly be painted as this villainous force. This same thought process can apply to Miguel in Across the Spider-Verse. His core motivation is wanting to keep the balance of the Spider multiverse, and based on his experience, he believes the way to do so is by letting these canon events take place, even if they center around the loss of a life. Again, the motivations are kinda there, as it would be a pretty huge risk to even test your luck against the canon events, considering the perceived consequences of losing your whole universe. It also doesn't help that the protagonist, who the story frames to be in the morally right, is a 15-year-old kid versus the hundreds of different spider people who support the canon event theory, but Miguel is still an antagonist. They have to paint him in a more nefarious and corrupt light, so it's easier to root against him. So he is written to show a lot of aggression, having a short temper, not willing to explore any alternative options, being isolated often, and being heavily haunted by his past trauma. Again, just trying to overshadow his original intentions through darker character traits and actions to try to place him narratively in the wrong. And I wouldn't be surprised if they made him outright wrong in the sequel, with them finding out that the canon event theory is completely wrong. But even if he was incorrect, those original good-natured intentions are still there. Even if his methods may be extreme and his anger abundant, Miguel wasn't necessarily wrong in wanting to save the multiverse. Just like how Thanos wasn't necessarily wrong to want to stay ahead of resource depletion. It's just that they are the antagonists, so they must operate in this extremist, darker manner, as they are fundamentally supposed to oppose the rootable protagonists. Interstellar is an extremely boring and mediocre movie. Alright, I think that's enough for today.